Optical illusions have been utilized throughout art history for many years and has been a tool to be utilized within various abstract ideas, from landscapes to more dreamlike drawings, and perhaps no artist more famous than MC Escher himself is a great example of how someone can strategically and creatively incorporate these really fun and interesting optical illusions to create strange terrain and ultimately a very unique and beautiful abstract artwork. With that being said, hey guys, my name is Matt. Welcome to another video by artincontext.org, and in today's video we will be going through some fun and interesting optical illusion drawings that you can utilize in many ways, and especially if you are interested in surrealist ideas and how to incorporate unique elements into your own artwork. Now we're going to go through a few of them, and some of them are much more simple than others. However, all of them are very doable, all of them are very digestible once broken down into a few simple steps. Now the first one we're going to start off with is actually a really popular one, and it's called the impossible triangle. So basically the impossible triangle is a very popular optical illusion drawing. In many ways, three-dimensional rules are broken, which results in a seemingly impossible object, hence the name the impossible triangle. So the first step is we're going to begin by drawing this L shape. So using your ruler and pencil, you want to start by drawing two lines parallel to one another in a vertical direction. We basically will want to make sure that we draw this L type shape, so make sure the lines are all the same in width between one another and that the L shape is the same length for both the vertical and horizontal sections. Now once you have your two vertical parallel lines, you can connect another two parallel lines to the bottom of the first two at the corners. They should be the same in width, with the bottom two moving in a diagonal direction to create an L shape that is the same in length as well. Now the next thing we're going to do is, by making the L shape three-dimensional, now that we have this two-dimensional L shape, we want to add lines to make it three-dimensional. So we do this by creating a set of small diagonal lines that all move in the same direction parallel to one another from each corner of the L shape. From there we can now add in lines to the top of the L shape to the end of the L shape, so making sure we add lines to the top of the L shape near the end. We want to use the three-dimensional diagonal lines to basically guide the placement of these connecting lines. We want to make sure that the width of the lines always remain the same, so that's important to remember. From there we now want to draw another connecting line, or a few connecting lines that run parallel underneath the first two using the same width as before. By doing this, we will give the connecting lines three-dimensionality and ultimately making the structure flow in an infinite loop. Now once we have done that, we can begin by erasing the lines inside the middle section and the top section of the triangular shape. And as we do this, we will start to see the impossible triangular shape appear in 3 dimensions. To kind of emphasize the shape, you can start to integrate some shading. So to further emphasize the three-dimensionality quality of the shape, we can add shading to certain parts of the triangular shape. Starting with the middle section, you can add some shading that has a dark to light gradient that flows through the triangular shape. And then we can add another gradient of shading from the other corner of the triangle, but this time keeping it slightly lighter. This way we will be left with 3 different shades or tonal values in each part of the triangular shape, and ultimately enhancing the three-dimensional nature of this impossible triangle. But otherwise guys, that's the general way of how to draw the impossible triangle. Very popular structure, being utilized within Escher's work himself, kind of applying this concept on a larger scale that kind of sets the platform for landscapes that figures can walk along, and ultimately playing with these very surrealist ideas of reality. Now the next one we're going to move on to drawing is called the impossible trident. So the impossible trident is perhaps the most recognizable optical illusion drawing. This is a great illusion drawing that is both interesting and complex, but so simple to draw. So let's break down the process of this optical illusion. Now step 1 is using your pencil and ruler to begin to draw each rod shape that moves in a diagonal direction. We want to make sure that the end of each rod is rounded and that they are all same in width. So we want to make sure that we draw 3 rods, but we also want to make sure that each of those rods in the trident shape is slightly shorter than the last. So by doing this, we will create a sense of depth within the trident structure. However, we won't draw the third one now, as it will basically connect by the use of the connecting lines, which we will kind of get into now. Now the idea is that we will basically connect the bottom lines of the bottom rod to the inside of the top rod. However, the line doesn't touch the top rod but flows along the inside of the top rod shape whilst remaining parallel to the top rod's lines. So this line will flow along the inside of the top rod and then come out, bend downward, and flow into the top line of what will become the third and the lowest rod. So take some time with this and make sure each rod is the same in width but not in length. So carrying on with the same line, we want to connect that line to the back of the trident, creating the square shape as a base of the rods. We should start to see the trident forming more clearly at this point. And what we should also be able to see is that the rod can connect with a single line. So that is kind of the trick with this specific optical illusion drawing, whereby the bottom line of the bottom rod flows into the back of the trident and then becomes the top line of the top rod. So we can also connect the bottom line of the top rod to the top line of the middle rod with a vertical line. Now, lastly, to kind of again emphasize three-dimensionality, we can now draw cylindrical shapes within each rod, giving it a more three-dimensional effect. And this is obviously just to emphasize the quality of this optical illusion drawing. So we can create this cylindrical shape within each rod with parallel lines that run along the inside of each rod. We want to make sure that the lines curve at the end of each rod within the trident shape, giving the ends a rounded quality. As we do this within each rod, we will find that the bottom two can be closed at their back ends with a straight line, and then the top rod's inside line should still flow through to the outside lines of the bottom rod. From there, we can draw a circle inside the ends of each rod to emphasize the cylindrical shape of the rods a little further, and we can also give the trident more three-dimensionality by adding shape to the inside section at the base of the trident by the middle rod. Lastly, we can start to outline the trident. So using a ballpoint pen or something of that nature, we can now outline the structure of the trident to define the form of the shape a little more, making sure you are patiently going over the lines with your pen, using a ruler for the straight parts of the trident optical illusion drawing. At this point, we should have an impossible trident optical illusion drawing that is outlined and defined through our pencil process and pen drawing process. And then lastly, we can start to add some shading to the trident. So we can now basically color the circles at the end of each rod black with our pens, but we can also start to add shading to each rod, creating gradients that flow from dark to light. And this is just going to again emphasize the three-dimensional quality. This step is more intuitive and should be done according to how you would like to shade the trident. So you can play around with different shading directions within the trident to emphasize the strange effects within the impossible trident, and ultimately making it a little more trippy than it intended to be. But otherwise, guys, that is the general process of how to draw the impossible trident. And now we're going to move on to the next one, and that is basically the distorted chessboard. Now, this is something straight out of a Alice in Wonderland image. This is also something really fun to incorporate into interesting and surrealistic drawings that could be used as basically the platform along which events or structures are drawn. Beyond that, it's just a really fun and simple way to create an optical illusion, but it is very useful. It can be used in so many ways. Now, we basically start by drawing a square. So we want to start by drawing an even square that is whatever size you would like. However, we want to make sure that it is even in length and width. So we do want to make sure it's a perfect square. From there, we can basically draw a diagonal line that connects to opposite corners within our square. Once we have our square, we then want to add evenly measured increments along all sides of the square and along the diagonal line within the square. We do want to add a little dot of evenly measured increments that correlate with the size of the square, and we do want to make sure that they're all the same size along the diagonal line and along the vertical and horizontal axis. Now, this means that if you have a square of 16 centimeters, you use a set of 1 or 2 centimeter increments along the edges of the box. This way, once we start drawing our lines, we will connect them seamlessly within the square. Now, from there, from each corner of your square on either side of the diagonal line, you will connect a straight line from the corner to each measured increment along the diagonal line. So we want to take our time using our rulers to connect the lines using the corners of the square, making sure they connect to the dots along the diagonal line within the square. We then can proceed to do the same on the other side of the diagonal line, connecting the straight line from the corner of the square to the dots along the diagonal line within the square. From there, we want to connect the dots with the straight lines that run parallel with the diagonal line. So we can do this on either side of the diagonal line, resulting in a set of lines that cross over perpendicularly to the others that flow from the corners of the square. And what we should be left with is this very interesting checkerboard effect that basically is establishing these squares that become larger as it moves towards the diagonal line, giving the diagonal line this kind of corner of a three-dimensional box effect. Now from there, we want to make sure that we outline the square with something dark, so maybe like a ballpoint pen. So make sure you use your ruler and slowly go over all these lines. We want to make sure that every line is emboldened with pen. And then lastly, what we will do is we'll basically use a marker, and we basically want to start on one side whereby we fill in the squares with the chessboard sequence, trying to go row by row, first just marking which square is to be filled in. So you can kind of, in the smaller, more narrow squares, you can kind of fill them in with a dot or mark them with a dot, which areas should be basically filled in with a marker. The more patient you are, the more likely you are to not make any silly mistakes. So you don't want to get to this point, rush it, make a mistake, and have to start all over again. So make sure you take your time. But otherwise, the idea is to then kind of fill in these boxes, moving from one side of the square, from one corner all the way to the diagonal line, and then shifting back into the other side all the way to the opposite corner of your square. And from there, it's simply a matter of taking your time, making sure you fill in all the squares with a marker, making sure you follow the checkerboard sequence. And this is why it's good to start from one side and kind of slowly work your way through the square, so you don't start on either corners and make a mistake with the sequence. So otherwise, guys, that's the general process of how to create a really fun, really interesting distorted checkerboard or chessboard. Can be used in so many different ways and ultimately is really easy to draw. Now the next thing we're going to do is basically draw the corridor illusion. Now this is a less popular illusion, but it does give the effect of paper kind of having these set of corridors that move in this three-dimensional nature into the page itself. Now the idea is that we're going to basically start by drawing a 3x3 square. So we want to start by creating this 3x3 columned and row square. So we want to make sure that we draw a square that can be divided perfectly into three, both in length and height. So once we have done that, we're going to basically move on to drawing these smaller squares within those larger squares. Now once we have our 9 squares, our 3x3 larger square, we should have these like 9 small squares inside. We then want to basically draw a set of smaller squares in each of those larger squares. So if we use the same width within each square, we should find that the far corners all align with the center square. So the idea is to just make sure that you're using a single measurement for the width between the smaller squares inside each of those larger squares. So maybe using something like 1 centimeter or 2 centimeter. You do want to make sure you spend time on this using your ruler and the same width for each square so that they are accurate. You can draw a line from opposite corners to see if they basically intersect perfectly in the middle square, and if they do, then you know you have drawn an accurate amount of 9 squares within your larger square structure. Now from there, we're basically going to begin by drawing the shading guidelines. So using our pencils, we can now start to outline the smaller inner squares within each square. So we should have a total of 9 evenly sized squares at this point. Now once we have done that, we now want to draw a straight line in each square that aligns with each corner of each square to the center point of the middle square that is basically in the middle of all 9 squares. However, we want to only keep the lines visible in the squares, which means we should be left with a corridor effect in each square. Now that we have our squares and our corridor lines, we now want to use our pencils and shade a gradient from dark to light. And this is where we want to spend most of our time, because it's really a matter of capturing the gradient depending or corresponding to each square and its position within this optical illusion drawing. So we want the darkest parts of the shading to be positioned in the corners of each square closest to the center square. Basically, the center square is going to be the darkest, and then we'll find that as we shade in each square around that center center square, we can kind of use the center square to define where the shading will naturally be most darkest in each square as we kind of go through each of them and work our way through all 9 squares. We want to make sure that we shade along the horizontal and vertical planes of each corridor wall in each corridor, so making sure the shading aligns with the corridor or the correct plane within each corridor. Now naturally, the only square that will be visible in terms of all panels will be the center square. So you know that if all the panels in the center square are correct and they kind of correspond to the surrounding squares, you know that obviously you have done this accurately. So you do want to make sure you just take time on setting up the guidelines, establishing those shading lines or the directional lines in terms of the corridor walls, and then basically take your time with shading in those various parts. And as you shade in each corridor, you'll start to see how the effect of depth starts to appear within the optical illusion drawing. So this is more a matter of shading, and this is also just a really good way to practice your shading and how to establish these qualities of depth specifically within this optical illusion drawing. But otherwise, once you have shaded in each square, you should have a set of corridors that fade into the darkness. But otherwise, there you have it, a really fun, really interesting illusion drawing, a little different to the rest of them. Can again be used in various ways. It's just a matter of how creative you are. But now we're going to move on to another optical illusion drawing. This one is also pretty popular, and it is the impossible square. So another great illusion. This illusion is another popular one that gives the strange effect of an infinite loop in the form of a square. So let's see how we can create this unique illusion through a few steps once again. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to begin by drawing squares within a square. So let us start by drawing a simple square with our pencils. We want to make sure that we draw an evenly sized square both in width and length. From there we want to draw another 2 squares, each 1 centimeter in width inside of the last one. So we should at this point have 3 lined squares all intersecting at 1 centimeter widths as they get smaller. So we can obviously naturally just make sure that every time we draw a smaller square in the last square, it is the same width, and this can be 1 centimeter, 2 centimeter, it's up to you. From there, we're basically going to cut the edges of the largest square. So now we want to erase the edges in a diagonal fashion of the square that is on the outside, the outermost square. We can do this at the intersection points of the outer and middle square lines where they create a perpendicular point. Now we do this by drawing diagonal lines that are also 1 centimeter in width from the perpendicular corners of the first square and the middle square. This can be measured as a 1 centimeter distance from each corner in width and length from the outer corners of the largest square. From here we should have an octagonal shape with long sides and short corners. So we should still have 2 more squares on the inside of the largest one with each 1 centimeter in width from the last. Now from there we're going to move on to basically outlining the impossible square shape, and this is just going to help us refine the actual shape and give us an understanding of where to shade. So we now want to draw a set of 90-degree lines starting from the highest corner at the left point of the octagonal shape. So this line will go down vertically and then along the bottom horizontal line of the inside square and stop at the vertical line of the inside square. Now once you have drawn a 90-degree line, you will find that as you rotate through the shape, we should have 4 of these 90-degree angles rotating through the shape. So from there we want to erase any pencil lines inside the shape, and then from there we can embolden the outer octagonal shape and inner square. Once again, we want to just make sure that the shape is more distinct and clear with maybe a black marker or something a little more distinct in terms of medium to point out that impossible square shape. And then lastly we can proceed to add some shading to our impossible square, and this is just another way to further the 3-dimensional optical illusion effect within the impossible square. So we do this by starting at one point of the square and creating these gradients that shift from dark to light with our ballpoint pens. So again, make sure you take your time and you just simply want to rotate through each section in the shape one by one, adding in shading that flows in opposite directions. And again, that just like kind of emphasizes the optical illusion and gives it a very unique and interesting shaded quality. But otherwise guys, that's the general process of the impossible square. And now we will move on to the last one, a very simple one, very easy, very popular, and that is the impossible staircase. Now the last optical illusion is much easier than the others, and the way in which we can start this is, once again, we're going to start by drawing the guideline. So we want to start by drawing an evenly measured square that is the same in length and width once again. So try to use an even number to construct your square, maybe something like 16 centimeters by 16 centimeters. It's up to you, but just make sure they are the same in measurements, making sure the length and width is obviously the same. So try to use an even number, and this is just going to be much better. From there, we'll want to start creating stairs by creating 2 centimeter increments. Let's say if you're obviously using an evenly sized square, you can start using 2 centimeter increments along the horizontal and vertical axis of the square. So as we make one vertical and horizontal set of rows in the square, we will continue to make them on top of the last set. So by doing this, we will slowly construct intersecting lines that use the same 2 centimeter increments. From there, we're going to move on to actually creating a staircase. So you want to work your way from one corner to the opposite corner on the other end of the square. Once you are done, you should easily be able to outline a staircase shape, and you can erase any other unnecessary lines around the staircase. From there, we can move on to creating the impossible staircase. So at the bottom of the last step, you want to draw another 2 centimeter horizontal line extending out from the bottom corner of the bottom stair. You then want to continue that line diagonally in a parallel 2 centimeter width with the bottom stair. Keep drawing a parallel line along the bottom stair until you get to the vertical point of that bottom stair. Once you get to the vertical part of the bottom stair, extend that vertical line until it reaches the same horizontal plane as the top horizontal line of the top stair. You then can connect that line to the top right corner of the top step with a horizontal line, and then from there it's a matter of just outlining the impossible staircase. But once we have done this is another way of kind of practicing and utilizing shading to really emphasize the actual optical illusion quality of this drawing. So we should have the impossible staircase at this point. However, we want to emphasize its optical illusion quality with some shading. Once you have shaded every step, you will have a strange impossible staircase illusion drawing, and that's how you draw an impossible staircase in a few simple steps. Easy and simple. But again, guys, these are just really fun, really easy drawings to go through. A great way to practice your drawing skills in terms of shading, just measurements, scale using other tools like ruler, working with other mediums like pen is really good for these types of drawings. And once again, you can also utilize these optical illusions as parts of maybe an abstract or surrealist drawing idea, kind of creating these strange structures that maybe characters and people and whatever you choose to draw can interact with. But otherwise, guys, thanks again for tuning in. If you like the video, please let us know in the comment section below. If you're interested in similar related topics, please give us a like and a subscribe. That helps us to grow the channel, which ultimately enables us to make more art related content for you guys, which we love. But thanks again for tuning in. I hope this was helpful. I hope you can play around with these tools and concepts and kind of apply them to your own work and process. But thanks again. I'll see you next time. Until then, cheers.